Hello, Bible readers. I want to make sure that you read today's text, Exodus 22, verses 21 to 27, before listening to the post. If you haven't yet read it, pause me. I'll stay right here. So this stretch of Exodus is describing, as Brueggemann calls it, covenantal economics. Remember, the covenant God makes with Israel is conditional. There is a big if. If you trust and obey, you qualify to be a holy nation, a priestly people. Obey what exactly, though? Well, here we get at the exactly. The commandments of chapter 20, verses 1 to 17 are followed in chapter 24, verse 3 and verse 7 by an oath of allegiance to the God of these commandments. But notice that there's some stuff in between, right? So in between the Big Ten and the oaths, there are some loose, kind of a seemingly random collection of littler commandments. Scholars call this section the Book of the Covenant. These get more specific to local matters in the Hebrew community of that moment, while the Big Ten are dealing in broad principles and generalities. Brueggemann says he picked these verses for today's pivotal point in Scripture because they are the taproot in the tradition of the commandments that has in recent times resulted in the notion of God's preferential option for the poor. Like, where does an idea like that come from, that God prefers to work for and advocate on behalf of the poor? That's a Vatican II phrase, by the way, God's preferential option for the poor. And if you don't know what Vatican II is, the Roman Catholics gathered in an all-world Vatican Council in the late 1960s. They hadn't done a Vatican Council but one other time, like 1700 or 1600 years before that. So this was a very big deal. They made a lot of big statements regarding the church's practices and policies and statements. And so they would make statements on lots of different stuff, including statements on how does God feel about the poor, for example. This is when Latin was no longer required to be a part of the liturgy. And it's when leaders started making statements regarding God's love for the vulnerable. Statements like these obviously have a lot of biblical support that starts in this biblical moment in Exodus, where this condition, these requirements are given. You shall not oppress an alien, an immigrant. You shall not abuse a widow or an orphan. This is a big deal in Exodus because it's a patriarchal society. And what that means is a man's protection, a man's earning power are necessary to anyone who isn't a man. Those without a man in their life suffer. Like, for certain, they get exploited. It's how things work. So God addresses this as a part of the 10th commandment, you shall not covet. One way people in power break the commandment, the 10th commandment, you shall not covet, is to acquire wealth at the expense of the most vulnerable of their neighbors. Don't do that, God says. And so God doesn't just say that, but God offers God's protection under this covenantal law, otherwise known as Torah. And here's some motivation from God to follow these commands. God says, remember, you were aliens, immigrants in the land of Egypt. That should move you to compassion. And number two, if you do abuse these people, widows and orphans and immigrants, when they cry out to me, and this is the same verb for cry out that was used when Israel cried out under their slavery in Egypt, when the abused, exploited ones cry out to me, I will hear them, and I will kill you, and your own wives and children will become widows and orphans. So there's a little more motivation. In case you're not moved to compassion, remembering that you were counted among aliens when you were slaves in Egypt, if that doesn't move you to compassion, I will be moved to wrath. This shows us that God is not some bystander that throws up divine arms at the sight of economic injustice. No. God promises to take action. God's self, by the way. Same goes for taking advantage of loans that someone can't pay back without suffering. This too is an arena that easily creates victims. Don't do that. God will hear the cry of the oppressed. Here we see in detail that as much as the God of the emancipation from slavery in Egypt, when we read that part of Exodus, we saw that, oh, this God is a strong God, stronger than any power on earth, even stronger than Pharaoh, doing things Pharaoh's magicians could not do. As much as we saw in that part of Exodus that God is an inclusive God, gathering a mixed multitude, a nobody nation into a chosen people. In this part of Exodus, we see that God is full of compassion toward the victim and full of wrath toward predators. This compassion and wrath describe covenantal economics. This is an alternative economy to almost every other economic system ever devised. In God's covenantal economics, predatory coveting is disallowed and punished. Brueggemann quotes a text of Karl Marx, actually, that gets at something that we see all the time. He says, there is an accumulation of misery proportional to the accumulation of capital. The accumulation of wealth at one end, at the same time, is reflected in the accumulation of misery. The torments of labor, slavery, ignorance, brutalization, and moral degradation at one pole happen while wealth happens at the other. We, in the 21st century, are living in the midst of one of the greatest accumulations of wealth among the fewest people of all time. That's not a partisan belief, that's a fact. Can any of us say that so few being so wealthy is wise, while millions and even billions remain vulnerable as widows, immigrants, orphans, refugees, and we could come up with lots of other categories for who the vulnerable are in our own times? The point of today's pivotal moment in Scripture, which gets repeated all the way through Jesus and beyond, is that divine wrath and divine compassion will not let this stand. And so we, in our own church, sing things like, "The world is about to turn." My next post is going to dwell in Exodus 29, verse 20. Priests down to tippy toes is what the chapter is called. Priests down to tippy toes. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.